Burnley is one of football's historic 12 towns, the famous dozen who founded the Football League amid the prosperity of the Industrial Revolution. A century later, Burnley is threatened by a new revolution, automatic expulsion for the league's bottom club.
Burnley had been recent champions of England, but as they paraded their title around town, the sports had already changed. And for Burnley this meant an inevitable and relentless demise from the top right down to rock bottom. The cat was let out of the footballing bag when the maximum wage was abolished in 1961 and George Eastham's campaigning led to the dissolution of the retain and transfer system. Suddenly, players had quite a lot of power. Harry Potts and later his former player Jimmy Adamson could only do so much, whilst they remained in the upper echelons of English football as late as the 61-62 season, almost completing a league and cup double. Their time was running out. The more the 60s went on, the more Burnley sunk into the mid-table, surviving off the sales of key players. Once it had been a trickle, John Connolly to Manchester United, Gordon Harris to Sunderland 3 years later, before Willie Morgan also departed for Old Trafford. The Clarets temporarily slid into Division 2 and it accelerated the process as the early 70s were marked by increased fees and an increased exodus. Brian O'Neill to Southampton for 75 grand in 1970 had become Leighton James being flogged to the Champions Derby for 310 grand 5 years later. Most years Adamson lost a key player, Ralph Coates to Spurs in 71, whilst the following year marked the departures of Steve Kindon to Wolves and Dave Thomas to QPR. 73 offered respite, but shortly after, Martin Dobson left for Everton for an enormous 300 grand. It barely balanced the finances but not the playing side, and with 1976's relegation, the process was expedited. Ray Hankin and Brian Flynn to Leeds in successive years before Terry Cochran and Tony Morley escaped to Middlesbrough and Aston Villa in the late 70s when it was apparent that Burnley weren't returning to the big time anytime soon. They were losing over £100,000 a year as Turf Moor could no longer guarantee five-figure attendances. The return of Potts and his Blackpool side in January 1976 marked Burnley's elimination from the FA Cup as well as the resignation of Jimmy Adamson. His assistant Joe Brown was invited to take over, and so the slide down into the second division was complete.
There been a signal. And that's gone in, and who got the last touch there, I've no idea.
At nearly the first sign of trouble, Burnley leant on the well-worn cliché of a club in crisis. They went back to hire a former club legend. Without a league win in nearly 4 months, and after going down to such results as home defeats to Millwall and Plymouth as well as a 4-4 draw against Charlton, Joe Brown was gone. Relegation had only been averted at the last thanks to a business end of the season where the Clarets were incredibly hard to beat, a trio of draws interspersed with a derby win over Blackburn at Turf and a famous 1-0 triumph over Chelsea later in April. Their second division status was confirmed when Notts County were defeated in the penultimate game of the season. Despite the names of Steve Kindon and Leighton James coming back to Turf Moor in the summer of 77, Burnley made an utterly abject start to the campaign, failing to win until an October the 8th win at home to Bristol Rovers. It would get better, however.
Shipman chips it across, Noble there.
Cup winners of the recent past and not too distant future gone toe-to-toe with Burnley staved off relegation to the third tier in dramatic circumstances. At the beginning of March, the Clarets sat rock bottom of the decision, staring at an inevitable relegation. Then followed one drop point from 8 fixtures or promotion form as Burnley somehow manufactured a top half finish out of the campaign. That brilliant form bled into the subsequent 78-79 season as Blackburn, West Ham, Fulham and Crystal Palace all fell before the halfway point. Ultimately, it was a campaign of consolidation in the league.
Vince Hilaire on the far side, a tremendous ball, and Ian Walsh diving driving ahead and comfortable.
With the half-hearted promotion bid fizzling out relatively early, it was clear that the season belonged to a magical cup run. Alright, Brighton were quick to eliminate Burnley from the League Cup third round in October, and Liverpool toyed with the Clarets in the FA Cup fifth round, but we're here to talk about the Anglo-Scottish Cup, where names as varied as Celtic and Mansfield Town were beaten after sinking local opposition in the summer group phase. Oldham provided the opposition in a two-legged final, one that was effectively over before the Turf Moor second leg, thanks to the Clarets' 4-1 triumph at Boundary Park. If the same cup had been important to Brian Clough in injecting belief into his would-be European champions Nottingham Forest 2 years prior, it wouldn't have the same galvanising effects in East Lancashire. For example, Harry Potts was sacked by October 1979 after failing to win a single one of their first 16 league matches of the season.
He declines to accept the advice. Oh dear, what a disaster! Give yellow shirts back. And it's going to come to Shanks. And it's deflected in by Brennan. To Walsh, Allen is now unmarked. And Goddard gets it in. Couldn't get on the end. Oh, beautifully taken by David McCreary. Allen to his left, boy can go alone. Here is Allen. That's 5, so simple. Well, the goalkeeper moved and was in no position to make a stop. Here is the man over. And oh dear, Rona who scores in the end.
Brian Miller returned to the club, with Burnley hoping that the former player, who had never managed a senior club before, was able to know the club so well that he'd transform them into a competent unit. While some form would be found either side of Christmas, their 6 wins all season could be found inside of a 10-game spell between November 24th and February the 2nd. The Clarets were promptly relegated to the 3rd Division. With an annual deficit now standing at 300 grand and the club treading water as low as the 3rd tier of English football for the first ever time, the Clarets were on the rocks. 1980-81 was a season of stagnation as Burnley sloped to 10 goalless draws and damning defeats at places like Walsall, Carlisle, Barnsley and Portsmouth, which ceilinged the Clarets to a mid-table position of 8th, 9 points away from promotion. That summer, Bob Lord retired as chairman, with the club passing on to a consortium headed by local businessman John Jackson for just £52,000. Jackson would hire Derek Gill to take a look at the finances. He analyses them, declares them a joke, noting suppliers were not being paid, the position with the inland revenue on PAYE and national insurance was chaotic, and the VAT commitment was something to ignore and hope it would go away. Despite that, as well as just 2 wins from their first 13 fixtures that had them in a relegation spot as late as Halloween, the Clarets turned it around. This new look Burnley surged up the division, built off the back of Alan Stevenson's goalkeeping, a spine of local lads including Adam Wharton and Mike Phelan, Brian Laws at fullback, Vince Overson next to him, while star attractions Billy Hamilton and Trevor Stephen were combined with a mix of Silk in Kevin Young and Martin Dobson, and the steel of Tommy Cassidy and Derek Scott.
There's the break, that's the pass, and that's the goal, which is Tommy Cassidy. And how's that for a perfect chip?
A run of 1 league defeat in 30 ran right through the campaign that catapulted Burnley right into the promotion conversation. In a new world of 3 points for a win, but not yet in a universe where teams as low as 6th could be given the chance of a playoff, Burnley's season hung in the balance. Then Southend turned up and stuck a mind-boggling 5 beyond the Clarets at Turf Moor to set in some doubt. But this had been a more resilient Burnley, and in dropping just 4 points from their remaining 7, the Clarets not only went up but were crowned champions on goal difference. By January, Brian Miller was sacked.
We should perhaps have scored really there. And now a chance for Glavin, who has done.
Chip it and does it beautifully.
Wolves have Kellogg, number 7, going over the ball, and Palmer finding a way around it.
After defeat at Bolton in January '83, after another horrendous start, Burnley were looking for a new manager. This despite re-signing Brian Flynn and adding Will Donachie. The Clarets' form didn't rebound. They'd gone to win 12 of 46 matches in league competition upon their return to Division 2, patently not enough to remain in the league, but they still managed to thrash Middlesbrough and Carlisle and stick 7 beyond Charlton. But the 1982-83 campaign belonged to the cup competitions.
White Hart Lane, 45 seconds into the second half. Third young striker Terry Gibson with a Roberts heading into his own goal. And Burnley are level after 70 minutes. Taken by Kevin Young, Steve Taylor in at the near post, and Hamilton making no mistake. Cross deflecting off the hapless Roberts. 3-1 to Burnley with 3 minutes left. Glass in his second goal.
12 wins in the league, Burnley had nearly matched that tally in the Cups, their most famous being a simply stunning 4-1 triumph at White Hart Lane in the quarter-final of the League Cup. Predictably, Liverpool would be too much for the Clarets in the semi-finals, with Wembley looming, but Burnley did manage to win the return leg. They were still in the FA Cup, however, after dispatching of Carlisle after a third-round replay and sinking Swindon Town, before Crystal Palace also fell after another replay, and it left Sheffield Wednesday in the quarter-finals.
And Taylor will take the penalty and hits it straight at the goalkeeper. Dobson changed his mind and escapes. No, he doesn't. Skirting in a bit. Oh, that's a brilliant goal.
The Owls were taken the distance all the way to Hillsborough for yet another replay before ultimately they were just too strong, swatting aside the Clarets by 5. And so back to reality, where relegation had long been on the cards. Caretaker manager Frank Casper and his team were dispensed with at the end of the campaign. Burnley needed to change, and John Jackson remarked the production line that had produced Harry Potts and Jimmy Adamson had come to an end. Crashing back down to earth in Division 3, Burnley were going in a new direction and saw 3 prospective managers staring back at them. Out of John Bond, John Duncan and Frank Burrows, they opted for the former, owing for his work in rejuvenating Bournemouth, transforming Norwich, as well as taking Manchester City to an FA Cup final. He bounced into the job with the fateful remark, "If my record at other clubs is anything to go by, it shouldn't take long to put things right." Instantly, he stripped fan favourite Martin Dobson of the captaincy and handed it to his new signing Tommy Hutchison, who he had worked with at Main Road. Another popular talent in Brian Laws was sold at a snip for just £35,000, and whilst it didn't cause too much of a ripple at the time, hindsight would cast the impatient sale of academy product Lee Dixon as a poor choice. Then there was Willie Donachie, allowed to float to Oldham Athletic on a free transfer where he would wind up playing top-flight football. Bond's signings were hardly setting the world ablaze either. Dennis Stewart, Jerry Gow and Joe Gallagher, all of which struggled to maintain any remote kind of fitness. Then there was the rash decision to sign Steve Daly, who came in on a transfer fee of £20,000, but alongside a $150,000 guarantee that they would purchase him a new house. Outside of a hat-trick against Port Vale in April, he'd produced nothing and had his contract cancelled at the end of the campaign. Malcolm Waldron cost the club £85,000, but upon failing to dislodge the centre-half pairing of Overson and Phelan, he quickly pedalled back to the south coast at a loss of £25,000. Bond was seen as a bit of a Billy Big Bollocks in East Lancashire, something that might have been somewhat forgivable if he could have steered the football team some half-decent results.
In the very next move, Slater put Barrett away in the penalty area. The ball is eventually driven home by Phil Bater, his first goal since his £10,000 signing from Wrexham earlier this season.
There was optimism in the club's home form before Christmas, form that had earned Bond a fresh 2-year contract after defeating Wimbledon on Boxing Day, just as much as there was pessimism thanks to the away form, Billy Hamilton's dwindling goal-scoring touch and an injury to Kevin Reeves that stopped his career dead in its tracks. Wayne Biggins attempted to replace him, and in spite of 8 goals in 20 games, Burnley were marooned to mid-table thanks to losing 8 from their final 10. That summer the club received the windfall of £100,000 in sponsorship from Burnley Building Society, another £100,000 from sales of Bob Lord's former lands, and another £80,000 from Billy Hamilton's sale. However, the fee for the Northern Irishman was clearly an insult and merely a product of TSB demanding the club trimmed its debt. John Bond had brought in players on enormous wages, only selling those with a minor financial footprint. Behind the scenes, the club scurried to renegotiate bonuses in line with their position as a mid-table third-tier club. The Clarets now needed to draw 13,600 supporters to break even. In the 83-84 campaign, they weren't even getting half that. Debt was now at 600 grand, an overdraft of just half of that. Matters were hardly helped when John Bond ran his mouth in the tabloids and was quickly sacked. With not much time, Burnley turned to his assistant, John Benson. Both men would last 53 matches. The idea was to bring in experience. Former cup winner Alan Taylor, midfielder Barry Powell and fullback Kevin Hurd were those names. With the other professionals including Neil Watmore, the makeweight in the Billy Hamilton sale, the Clarets had more than enough to survive in Division 3.
On the edge of the area, couldn't really direct the header, but he got a second chance. Kevin Taylor, in off the post.
Paul Rayner thought his turn for a shot, mishits it, goes to Bannon, turns, nursing a broken toe, back of the net, number 3.
Benson even tried a 5-day break in Mallorca in February 1985, but after an initial bounce, a 3-1 win away at Bolton, the Clarets went 10 winless, putting their third-tier status in jeopardy. On May the 4th, John Bond's Swansea had the chance to pull the trigger and send Burnley unthinkably down into the basement of the Football League. Instead, the Clarets found some resolve, Alan Taylor scoring the only goal of the game. Within a point of safety, Burnley chucked it all away, losing at home against a Bristol City side who were in the midst of a half-hearted promotion attempt. Ultimately, Burnley's final day win at Walsall was futile thanks to Swansea's point at home to that same Bristol City side. Upon relegation, Benson naturally resigned, but nobody expected half of the board to follow. The club's slide down to rock bottom was being prepared as Frank Teasdale was appointed the club chairman. After 62 applications for the manager's post, Martin Buchan was appointed. He delivered Ray Deacon and Jim Hegarty to fill the void left behind by Mike Phelan at the heart of defence as the Clarets performed well in pre-season. Ultimately though, when it came to the real thing, the club were completely rudderless, scabbing slender wins against teams like Aldershot and Rochdale before throwing in an unforgivable performance away to Chester on October the 5th. A supposed fresh start evaporated into thin air just as quickly as it appeared. Martin Buchan had resigned after just 110 days at the club, and the Clarets Football League status was just about hanging on by a thread. But first, Tommy Kavanagh's promotion from assistant to the manager's post. Instantly, he spoke of bringing stability and credibility. Apparently, that included offering Ashley Hoskin his first professional contract with a rise from £32 a week to £200, including bonuses, as well as selling Wayne Biggins to Norwich City at a cut price of 40 grand. It should be noted once again, debts were still at a crippling £650,000. By February 1986, John Jackson had resigned from the board. 2 months later, a paltry 1,988 souls pitched up to Turf Moor to see Crewe Alexandra defeat the Clarets. It was long telegraphed, but the manager, who just could not stop wearing his Manchester United tracksuit, resigned in the summer with no results coming his way and his control diminished on medical grounds. Once again, TSB urged Burnley to tighten their belts further, which meant the disbandment of the reserve team and mass release of players, with only Vince Overson fetching a fee £25,000 to Birmingham City. After an uneasy 14th place and uneasy finances with only a more uneasy 3,204 people turning up to turf on a weekly basis, the Clarets were hit with a 1-2 punch in advance of the 86-87 campaign. First, their managerial target Martin Dobson had signed a new contract to be Bury's manager. Second, the usually not so important news that there was now free movement allowed between the Football League and non-league. Suddenly, the Clarets were in danger. So they went back to their Rolodex. Brian Miller, a former league winner with the club but now just a man running a newsagent's in the summer of '86, he was asked to be the club's next manager. A decent enough start began with triumphs over Wolves, Halifax and Scunthorpe as the Clarets eyed an immediate departure from the 4th tier. Until the collapse. Now victories as the ones achieved over Stockport in October, Colchester in November and Crewe in December sat like lonely islands amid a torrent of defeats. 4-1 at home to Preston, 4-1 at Northampton before quite possibly the worst result in club history, a 6-0 whipping at the hands of Hereford United on January 24th. Now that was rock bottom, although not quite literally, since Burnley was still 9 points above the dotted line. The one victory though that we didn't mention in that little run, a 3-1 win over Lincoln in November, which would become quite crucial later on. November also the scene of Telford United pumping Burnley 3-0 in the FA Cup first round. Whenever they looked like they were carving a way out, such as a 2-0 half-time lead against Hartlepool in January, they'd chuck in 2 points with a pitiful second half performance. Even the most memorable goal of the lot, Ashley Hoskin with his solo effort against Swansea, came in a needless 2-2 draw.
In the second half, one of the best individual goals in the history of Burnley Football Club. It was scored by 18-year-old Ashley Hoskin, who picked up the ball in his own half. And it remains a priceless jewel in a season when Burnley's crown was unmercifully battered.
Yet another 2 points were pissed away at the Shea in February, but that point was the beginning of a mini unbeaten run which saw the Clarets inconceivably win 2 league games on the bounce. Just as they received a nosebleed, Aldershot, Preston, Cambridge and Colchester all inflicted defeats on Burnley. Ahead of April 14th's relegation 6-pointer between 22nd place Torquay and 23rd place Burnley, things were unbelievably desperate. That can only be seen at its height with an excruciatingly late Leighton James penalty that saved a point. 4 days later, 3,000 Clarets turned up for the away day at nearby Rochdale, almost double the usual home taking for another 6-pointer. The 2-0 win kept 5 points between themselves and the sole relegation spot. But just as easily, Burnley slumped to 1 point from 3 to leave things hanging precariously with the introduction of May. Burnley entered the final 3 games bottom of the entire Football League, but quickly recovered the abominable situation with a win over promotion-chasing Southend United, as Rochdale went down to Torquay United. Unfortunately, Rochdale roared to safety in that last week, as local rivals Halifax and Stockport succumbed at Spotland. Together with the Clarets' defeat at Crewe, the final day left the fate of 3 clubs in the balance. Bottom of the pile, Burnley would host playoff-chasing Orient. Torquay entertained mid-table Crewe, whilst Lincoln travelled to the similarly placed Swansea. Burnley needed a win, plus at least 1 favour. Going into the final game, Turf Moor's average gate had been 2,800, only for 15,781 to turn up for the final game, potentially in Burnley's Football League history.
For half-time, Neil Brewcock got the vital first goal. Another goal early in the second half looked to have guaranteed Burnley's dramatic escape. News came in that their rivals were faltering, but Orient weren't sticking to the script, pulling a goal back 8 minutes later. At the final whistle though, Burnley had held on to their lead and their league status. It looked as though Burnley had won the league, but at least next season they'll still be playing in it.
And so they lived to fight another day. Instantly they re-entered the market for any kind of bargain they could find. Midfielder Paul Comstive, centre-half Steve Davies, forward George Agani and utility man Andy Farrell amongst 9 through the door for a combined £32,000. David Reeves would enter on loan just in time for the visit of Bolton in November after a capable start to the Clarets season.
Field, Hamilton, Comstive, knocking the ball in. Oh, there it is! 1-0! Not quite sure who scored it, but it looks like it might have been Ian Britton, number 7 Britton. Oh, dear me! Surely that must have been offside! Surely it must have been offside! 2-0! Burnley 2, Burnley 0, but what an appalling decision by the match referee there. Yards offside, miles offside, says Crombie.
With the club into what was now a comforting mid-table 4th division setting in the league, the campaign quickly became about the Football League trophy, then sponsored by Sherpa Vans, nowadays probably by an American pizza company or a disappointingly flat Southeast Asian energy drink. Anyway, after dispatching Tranmere, Rochdale, Chester and Bury in the earlier rounds, Halifax was sunk on penalties in the Northern semi-final before a staggering 33,000 people across 2 legs saw Burnley overcome local rivals Preston to book a spot at Wembley. There, just the 80,841 at the National Stadium for a match between 2 4th-tier outfits.
Then from the corner, Steve Bull turned goal maker. Onto striking partner Andy Much, and relief when Robbie Dennison floated in his free kick. 2-0.
The result didn't even matter that much. The cup run, though, resulted in a £210,000 profit and set the club up for the next few years. That summer, Brian Miller added a mix of youth and experience, Brendan O'Connell, Paul Atkinson and Gary Rowell, to a bright start results-wise. With promotion a possibility, the cliched purse strings were loosened. Winston, White and Ian Measham to add dynamism and width. Ultimately though, Burnley dropped off to 10th by the new year, but they were still well within the conversation, particularly with the recent invention of the playoffs. And yet, on January the 2nd, Brian Miller announced his resignation upon a loss at Tranmere, just when Burnley looked to have turned the corner, with a Burnley man through and through at the helm as well, the experience of a character-building relegation survival and the financial bolstering of Wembley. Now they seem back to square one. And as if the club were trying to highlight that, they got the man who replaced Brian Miller from his first Turf Moor stint to replace him after his second go at the job. Welcome back, Frank Casper.
And it's a goal! And it's Brendan O'Connell.
So it could be a promising attack again. It squirts across. It's a goal! That's the first goal of the afternoon. Paul Atkinson.
At first, the results appeared to pick up. Halifax, Stockport and Torquay all edged by in Casper's fun and laughter first weeks back into the job. It took 2 more months for him to find his 4th victory, by which point Channel 4 had commissioned the documentary Claret Blues, which hardly showed the club in a favourable light. And on April Fool's Day, sack the board chants could be heard ringing around turf with the visit of Hereford. There were 6 goals scored again in the match, but this time they were evenly distributed as opposed to all 6 being netted by the opposition. And the tumultuous period rumbled on when George Agani left the club later that month after a training ground bust-up with goalkeeper Chris Pearce. The summer meant a reboot with $80,000 pledged towards the new regime. John Deary and Tony Hancock demanded fees, whilst Roger Eli, Peter Mumby, Ron Futcher and Joe Jacob also joined on free transfers. The 89-90 campaign was one that started brightly with its 1 loss from the first 10 league fixtures, but quickly petered out into another middling campaign of mid-table hell. This was combined with a kick in the teeth towards the end of the campaign when a shareholder put up over 35,000 unissued shares, which could have potentially netted the club £2 million. But didn't. Whilst the £90,000 signing of John Francis was commissioned as a replacement for the poor Tony Hancock, the windfall never happened and Burnley's turgid campaign led to yet more demonstrations from supporters. It had become clear that the post-Orient revival had been killed stone dead. Casper was on the back foot, his assistant had taken up the job at Hull City, helping out with a certain Stan Ternant. Whilst Casper wouldn't benefit fully from John Pender's £70,000 acquisition from Bristol City, the club eventually would. In 1990-91 they'd become more resilient and in the springtime improved dramatically. Ahead of an April 13th trip to Scunthorpe, the Clarets had won just 2 games away from home all season. With 24 points to play for and just about cuddling onto a playoff spot, Burnley won 6 of their remaining games. Their first taste of the playoffs would come against Torquay United.
A Stuart Evans own goal summed up the evening. Burnley only left of thoughts of what might have been.
If you missed our first part of Burnley history and their winning of the old First Division in 1960, watch this video to get up to speed.